Security throws black pilot off plane. Then he calls FAA and grounds the flight. "Sir, you need to step away from that cockpit. This aircraft is for authorized personnel only. I am Captain James Wilson, and according to federal aviation regulations, I am the pilot in command of this aircraft. Now I suggest you check my credentials before you make another mistake." The security officer's face flushed red as he stood in the narrow galley of the Boeing 737. Behind him, passengers craned their necks to see what was happening. Some were already recording with their phones. Captain James Wilson, a 58-year-old veteran pilot with over 30 years of flying experience, stood calmly in his crisp uniform, gold stripes gleaming on his sleeves, his pilot's ID clearly visible on the lanyard around his neck. "I don't care who you claim to be," the security officer said, his voice rising. "We received a report of an unauthorized individual in the cockpit. You need to come with me now." James kept his composure, though his heart raced. In 3 decades of flying, he had faced this kind of treatment more times than he cared to remember. But not today. Not when he was responsible for the safety of 142 passengers waiting to fly from Atlanta to Chicago. "Officer," James said firmly, reaching into his pocket, "I'm going to take out my phone now. I'm calling the FAA's regional director, who happens to be a close friend. And then I'm calling your supervisor. This aircraft isn't going anywhere until this situation is properly resolved." The other passengers began to murmur. A flight attendant approached nervously. The co-pilot, a younger white man named Michael Reynolds, emerged from the cockpit looking confused. "What's going on, Captain?" Michael asked. Before James could answer, the security officer grabbed his arm. "That's it. You're coming with me?" The entire cabin fell silent. In that moment, James knew this confrontation would change everything for him, for the airline, and for every pilot who looked like him. But let's go back to how this all started. It was just 3 hours earlier when Captain James Wilson arrived at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport for what should have been a routine flight. James pulled into the employee parking lot at 6:15 a.m., well ahead of the 8:30 departure time for Continental Airlines Flight 1382 to Chicago O'Hare. The early summer sun was already warming the Georgia morning as he grabbed his pilot's case from the trunk of his Buick. As he walked toward the terminal, he nodded at the familiar faces of ground crew members he'd known for years. James had been flying out of Atlanta since the mid-90s, back when people still dressed up to travel and pilots were universally respected. Times had changed, but James still wore his uniform with immense pride. "Morning, Captain Wilson," called Elijah, an elderly baggage handler who had been working at the airport even longer than James had been flying. "Morning, Elijah. How's that grandson of yours? Still planning on flight school?" "Yes, sir. Got accepted to Embry-Riddle for the fall." "He won't stop talking about it," James smiled. "Tell him to look me up when he graduates. Always happy to mentor young talent." These moments were what James lived for, the community he'd built, the example he set. As one of the first black captains at Continental, he never forgot the responsibility he carried. Every flight, every interaction mattered. He made his way through employee security, where he exchanged pleasantries with the TSA agents who recognized him. Inside the terminal, he stopped for his ritual pre-flight coffee at the same cafe he'd been visiting for years. The barista, Maria, had his order ready before he reached the counter. "Captain's special black coffee, 2 sugars, she said with a warm smile. "Big day today?" "Just another day in the friendly skies, Maria," he replied, leaving his usual generous tip. "How are your kids doing in school?" As Maria updated him on her children's achievements, James felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned to find First Officer Michael Reynolds, a pilot in his mid-30s who would be his co-pilot today. "Morning, Captain," Michael said, extending his hand. "Looks like we're flying together again." "Good to see you, Michael," James replied, shaking his hand firmly. "Ready for a smooth ride to Chicago?" The two hadn't flown together often, but James remembered Michael as competent, if somewhat reserved. They walked together toward the briefing room, discussing the weather and flight plan. "Forecast says clear skies most of the way," Michael noted, scrolling through his tablet. "Some light turbulence approaching O'Hare, but nothing significant." "Good. Let's plan for a fuel-efficient climb to 38,000 feet, James suggested as they entered the briefing room. "I'd like to avoid that congestion over Cincinnati if we can get permission for a slight routing adjustment." The flight dispatcher, Brenda Thompson, a no-nonsense woman in her 50s who'd been with the airline for decades, looked up from her computer. "Already requested, Captain Wilson. I know how you like to run a tight ship." "You're the best, Brenda," James smiled. "Any maintenance issues I should know about?" Nothing major. There's a note about the auxiliary power unit running a little hot yesterday, but maintenance checked it overnight and signed it off. As they completed their briefing, James noticed a new face at the dispatch desk, a young man in his 20s with an assistant manager badge that read Richard Keller. Brenda caught James looking and whispered, "New management trainee. Corporate sent him down from headquarters. Been here 2 weeks and already trying to rewrite procedures that have worked for 20 years. James nodded understandingly. He'd seen many eager young managers come and go, each thinking they would revolutionize the airline industry with their fresh ideas from business school. After the briefing, James and Michael headed to the gate to inspect their aircraft. Walking through the terminal, James couldn't help but notice the double takes from some passengers, the momentary confusion that still flickered across people's faces when they saw a black man in a captain's uniform. After 30 years, he'd learned to ignore it, but it never entirely stopped stinging. At the gate, the morning's first complication arose. The gate agent, a harried-looking woman named Susan, rushed up to them. "Captain Wilson, we have a situation with the passenger manifest. We're overbooked by 3 seats, and we have an FAA inspector who needs to deadhead to Chicago." James considered the situation. "Let's see if we get any no-shows before we start looking for volunteers. If we need to bump someone, offer the standard compensation, but let's try to avoid removing any families with children." "Yes, Captain," Susan replied, relieved by his calm approach. As they continued to the jet bridge, Michael leaned in. "You handled that well. I've seen captains get flustered with last-minute passenger issues." James smiled. "After flying through thunderstorms and dealing with mechanical failures at 35,000 feet, a seating chart is hardly worth raising your blood pressure over." The aircraft pre-flight inspection went smoothly. James ran his experienced hands over the control surfaces, checked the engine inlets, and inspected the landing gear with a thoroughness that had become second nature. He introduced himself to the lead flight attendant, Gloria Washington, a veteran crew member he'd worked with many times before. "Good to see you again, Gloria. Any concerns with the cabin crew or service today?" "All good, Captain Wilson. We've got a full flight, including a tour group of seniors headed to Chicago for a music festival, some kind of blues reunion show." James brightened. "The Chicago Blues Revival. I saw the original back in '83 with my father, Buddy Guy, B.B. King, all the legends were there." "That's the one," Gloria smiled. "Maybe you can give them a smooth ride and a few good stories when we land." "I'll do my best," James promised, heading toward the cockpit to begin his pre-flight checks. In the cockpit, James settled into the captain's seat, the place where, despite all the challenges he'd faced getting there, he felt most at home. He ran his fingers lightly over the instruments, a ritual that connected him to every flight he'd ever piloted, from his first solo in a Cessna to commanding massive passenger jets across oceans. Michael took the first officer's seat beside him and began his portion of the checklist. Together, they methodically prepared the aircraft, their actions synchronized by training and protocol. "Flight controls," James called out. "Checked and free," Michael confirmed after moving the yoke through its full range. As they continued through their checks, James noticed Michael glancing at him occasionally. There was something unsaid hanging in the air between them. "Something on your mind, Michael?" James asked, keeping his tone casual as he checked the fuel quantity indicators. Michael hesitated, then spoke. "I hope this isn't inappropriate, Captain, but I've actually followed your career for years. You were one of the reasons I decided to become a pilot." James looked up, genuinely surprised. Michael continued. "My uncle flew with you on the Lowe's Angels route back in 2002. He told me stories about how you handled that engine failure over the Rockies. Said it was the most professional flying he'd ever seen." James remembered that flight, a tense situation that had required every bit of his training and experience. "That was a challenging day. Your uncle was a good first officer, stayed calm under pressure." "He said the same about you," Michael replied. "When I started flight school, he told me to study how Captain Wilson flies by the book, but with judgment. It's an honor to finally share a cockpit with you." The admission warmed James, reminding him that his decades of breaking barriers had impacts he couldn't always see. "Thank you for sharing that, Michael. Let's give your uncle something good to hear about on this flight, too." As they completed their preparations, James radioed ground control for their departure clearance. The familiar rhythm of aviation communication centered him, the standardized phrases a constant in an industry that had changed dramatically throughout his career. "Continental 1382, you're cleared to Chicago O'Hare via the PECHY-3 departure, then as filed. Climb and maintain 10,000, expect 38,010 minutes after departure." Cleared to Chicago via PECHY-3, climbing to 10,000, expecting 38,000. Continental 1382, James confirmed, writing down the clearance. As passengers began boarding, James listened to the ambient sounds of the cabin filling behind him. The muffled conversations, the overhead bins closing, the occasional question directed to the flight attendants, all part of the symphony of commercial aviation he'd conducted thousands of times. Through the open cockpit door, he heard the varied reactions as passengers glimpsed him in the captain's seat. Most didn't react at all, some offered friendly nods, and a few still showed that flicker of surprise. James had learned to focus on the job, not the reactions. Boarding process was nearly complete when James noticed a commotion at the front of the cabin. Gloria was speaking with a middle-aged white man in an expensive suit who seemed agitated. "Is there a problem?" James asked when Gloria approached the cockpit. "Passenger in 2A is asking if we have an experienced captain today. Says he's nervous about flying and wants reassurance," she explained quietly, her expression conveying what she wasn't saying out loud. James had encountered this before. "I'll handle it." He stepped out of the cockpit and approached the passenger, who was now settled in his first-class seat but still looking uncomfortable. "Good morning, sir. I'm Captain James Wilson," he said, extending his hand with a professional smile. "I understand you had some concerns about today's flight." The man looked up, momentarily startled. "Oh, I get anxious flying, wanted to make sure we're in good hands." "I completely understand flying anxiety," James replied smoothly. "I've been with Continental for over 30 years with more than 25,000 flight hours. Today's route has excellent weather conditions, and our aircraft just completed a thorough maintenance check. We'll be taking good care of you." The man's demeanor shifted subtly as James spoke, his expertise evident in every word. "Thank you, Captain. That's reassuring." "My pleasure. If you have any other concerns during the flight, our excellent cabin crew will be happy to assist you," James replied before returning to the cockpit. Michael had overheard the exchange. "You handled that diplomatically." "Part of the job," James responded simply, turning his attention back to their preparations. By 8:25 a.m., the aircraft was fully boarded, the doors were closed, and they were ready for pushback from the gate. James made his welcome announcement to the passengers, his deep, confident voice setting the tone for the flight. "Good morning from the flight deck. This is Captain James Wilson. On behalf of Continental Airlines and our entire crew, welcome aboard Flight 1382 to Chicago O'Hare. Our flying time today will be approximately 2 hours and 15 minutes. Weather in Chicago is partly cloudy with temperatures in the mid-70s. We're expecting a smooth flight today, and we'll be doing our best to get you to Chicago right on schedule." As the aircraft was pushed back from the gate, James felt the familiar sense of responsibility settle over him. For the next few hours, he was responsible not just for flying the aircraft, but for the safety and well-being of everyone on board, a duty he had never taken lightly. They taxied toward the runway, joining the morning departure queue. Atlanta was busy as always, with aircraft from around the world waiting their turn to take to the skies. James used the taxi time to double-check their flight plan and review the takeoff data one last time. When they reached the runway threshold, air traffic control cleared them for takeoff. James advanced the throttles, and the powerful engines responded immediately. The aircraft accelerated down the runway, and within moments they were airborne, the Georgia landscape falling away beneath them. As they climbed through 10,000 feet, the seatbelt sign was turned off, and the cabin crew began their service. The flight progressed normally, with James and Michael monitoring the aircraft systems and navigating around areas of light turbulence to keep the ride comfortable for their passengers. About halfway through the flight, as they cruised at 38,000 feet over Tennessee, James noticed something unusual on the engine monitoring display. The temperature reading for the right engine was fluctuating slightly, nothing dangerous, but enough to warrant attention. "Are you seeing this, Michael?" he asked, indicating the display. Michael leaned in to look. "Yes, sir. Temperature variance in the right engine, still within limits, but unusual." "Let's keep an eye on it," James decided. "Check the maintenance log again. Was there any write-up about the engine sensors?" As Michael reviewed the digital maintenance records, James made a small adjustment to the throttle setting and watched the readings carefully. The fluctuation continued but didn't worsen. "Nothing in the logs about sensor issues," Michael reported. "Want me to run a diagnostic?" "Go ahead," James confirmed. "And let's get on the radio with company maintenance. Better to check it now than have a surprise later." While Michael contacted Continental's Maintenance Control Center, James maintained their course, his hands steady on the controls. This was the kind of situation where experience made all the difference, knowing when a minor anomaly required immediate action and when it could be managed through careful monitoring. The maintenance specialist on the radio suggested a specific sequence of checks, which confirmed that it was likely a sensor issue rather than an actual engine problem. Still, James made note to have it thoroughly inspected upon landing in Chicago. "We'll have maintenance meet the aircraft," he told Michael. "I want this resolved before our turnaround flight." As they began their initial descent toward Chicago, James received a call from the lead flight attendant. "Captain, we have a medical situation in the main cabin. Elderly gentleman feeling lightheaded. We have a doctor on board who's assisting." "Thank you, Gloria. Keep me updated," James responded. "They think we need to expedite our arrival." After a brief consultation with the doctor, Gloria confirmed that it wasn't an emergency, but the passenger would benefit from getting on the ground sooner rather than later. James immediately contacted Chicago Approach Control. "Chicago Approach, Continental 1382. We have a passenger requiring medical attention. Not an emergency, but we'd like to request an expedited approach if possible." "Continental 1382, Chicago Approach. We can accommodate that. Turn right heading 340, descend and maintain 8,000. You are cleared for the ILS approach to runway 27R. Expect priority sequencing. Right to 340 down to 8,000, cleared ILS 27R. Thank you for the assistance, Chicago Approach." "Continental 1382, James acknowledged, already adjusting their course. He turned to Michael. "Let's start our descent checklist early. I want us configured and stable well before final approach." Michael nodded, immediately beginning the procedures. "Hydraulic pressure normal, anti-ice not required, altimeters set." James made an announcement to the passengers explaining that they would be arriving a few minutes ahead of schedule and might experience a slightly quicker descent than normal, but assuring them it was routine. His calm, authoritative voice helped maintain a sense of normalcy in the cabin despite the medical situation. Their approach into O'Hare was textbook perfect, with James hand-flying the aircraft smoothly despite the gusty crosswind that had developed. They touched down gently on runway 27R and taxied directly to their assigned gate, where medical personnel were already waiting to assist the ill passenger. After shutdown procedures were complete and the passengers had disembarked, James took a moment to check on the passenger who had taken ill. "He's going to be fine, Captain," the gate agent assured him. "Just dehydration and a touch of anxiety. The doctor who helped on board gave him the all-clear, but we've arranged for a wheelchair to help him to his connection." "Good to hear," James replied. "Please give him my best wishes." As the cleaning crew prepared the aircraft for the return flight to Atlanta, James and Michael debriefed on the flight deck. The engine temperature fluctuation had stabilized during their descent, but James insisted on having maintenance perform a thorough check before their departure. "I'll file the report while you take your break," Michael offered. "Anything specific you want me to emphasize?" "Note the timing of the fluctuations and that they correlated with our thrust adjustments during cruise," James instructed. "And make sure they check both the physical sensors and the electrical connections. Sometimes it's just a loose wire." After completing his post-flight responsibilities, James had just enough time for a quick meal in the crew lounge before their scheduled departure back to Atlanta. He found a quiet corner with a view of the bustling O'Hare tarmac and unwrapped the sandwich he'd brought from home, his wife Lisa's special chicken salad that had sustained him through countless flights. As he ate, he checked his phone and found a text from Lisa. "Hope your flight was smooth. Don't forget we have dinner with Diane and her new husband tonight. Love you." James smiled, thinking of his wife of 35 years. Despite the demanding nature of his career, they had built a solid life together, raising 2 successful children, their daughter now a cardiologist in Boston, their son a high school history teacher in Atlanta. Lisa had weathered the storm of his irregular schedules, long absences, and the additional burdens that came with being a black man carving out a space in a field that wasn't always welcoming. Her support had been his foundation. He replied, "Landing in Atlanta at 4:30 if all goes well. Plenty of time for dinner. Love you too." As he finished his lunch, a young black pilot in a regional airline uniform approached his table hesitantly. "Excuse me, Captain Wilson. I'm First Officer Darnell Jackson with Regional Air. I don't mean to interrupt your break, but I just wanted to introduce myself." James gestured to the empty chair across from him. "Not at all, First Officer Jackson. Please join me for a moment." Darnell sat down, his expression a mixture of nervousness and admiration. Thank you, sir. I've heard so many stories about you from my instructors at flight school. You're something of a legend, James chuckled. I don't know about that. I'm just a pilot who's managed to stay employed for a few decades. It's more than that, sir, Darnell insisted. When I told my grandfather I wanted to be a pilot, he showed me a newspaper article about you from the 90s. First black captain at Continental on international routes. That article hung on my bedroom wall through high school. The young man's words touched James deeply. He remembered the weight of being the first or one of the few, how every action felt scrutinized, how every mistake seemed to carry implications not just for himself but for those who would come after him. What routes are you flying now? James asked. Mostly short hops, Chicago to Detroit, Milwaukee, Indianapolis, building my hours for the majors, Darnell explained. I'm hoping to make captain in the next few years and eventually transition to international long haul. That's a solid path, James nodded approvingly. Keep your record clean, continue your education, and make connections. This industry is as much about who you know as what you know. Any other advice, sir? Darnell asked eagerly. James considered the question carefully. Remember that in the cockpit your competence speaks louder than anything else. There will be passengers, maybe even crew members, who see your skin before they see your stripes. Let your flying answer for you. Darnell nodded solemnly. I've already had a few encounters. I'm sure you have, James acknowledged. The key is to know which battles to fight and which to let go. Save your energy for the ones that matter. They chatted for a few more minutes about specific routes and aircraft systems before Darnell had to leave for his next flight. As they shook hands, James felt a sense of continuity, of passing the baton to the next generation. The aviation world Darnell was entering wasn't perfect, but it was better than the one James had faced decades ago. Progress was slow, but it was real. When it was time to return to his aircraft, James felt refreshed and focused. The maintenance crew had completed their inspection of the engine sensors and replaced a faulty temperature probe. The issue was resolved, and the aircraft was cleared for the return flight to Atlanta. Back at the gate, James was surprised to find a different first officer waiting for him. Captain Wilson, I'm First Officer Sarah Chen, the young woman introduced herself. There's been a crew change. First Officer Reynolds was reassigned to a New York flight that was short-staffed. Nice to meet you, First Officer Chen, James replied, quickly adjusting to the change. Last-minute crew swaps weren't uncommon in the airline business. Have you had a chance to review our flight plan yet? Yes, Captain. Weather looks good all the way to Atlanta, with a small line of thunderstorms to the west that shouldn't affect our route. Fuel load is standard plus 30 minutes reserve. Excellent. Let's do our pre-flight briefing, and then we'll head to the aircraft. The boarding process for the return flight went smoothly until James noticed a commotion at the boarding door. A gate agent was speaking with Richard Keller, the young management trainee he'd seen earlier in Atlanta. Beside them stood a nervous-looking man in his 30s clutching a Continental Airlines ID badge. Gloria, the lead flight attendant, approached the cockpit with a concerned expression. Captain, there seems to be an issue. That management trainee from Atlanta is here with someone he's introducing as today's captain. What? James unbuckled his harness and stood up. That's not possible. I'm scheduled for the round trip. He stepped out of the cockpit and approached the group at the boarding door. Richard Keller was showing the gate agent something on his tablet. Excuse me, James said firmly. I'm Captain James Wilson, the assigned pilot in command for this flight. What seems to be the problem? Richard looked up, momentarily flustered. Captain Wilson, there's been a scheduling adjustment. This is Captain Peter Dawson. He'll be taking over for the return leg to Atlanta. The man beside Richard shifted uncomfortably, avoiding James's gaze. I wasn't notified of any change, James stated calmly but firmly. And company policy requires at least 2 hours' notice for crew changes unless there's a medical emergency. It was a last-minute decision from operations, Richard insisted. There's a VIP passenger on this flight who specifically requested Captain Dawson. James raised an eyebrow. In 30 years of flying, he'd never heard of a passenger request overriding scheduled crew assignments. That's not how this works, Mr. Keller. Passengers don't get to choose their pilots, regardless of their status. The gate agent, a veteran employee named Tom, looked uncomfortable. Captain Wilson is right. I've never seen this kind of last-minute pilot swap for a passenger request. We'd need proper authorization from the chief pilot's office. Richard's face flushed. I have the authority to make operational decisions as assistant manager for ground operations, Tom interjected. Flight crew assignments fall under a different department entirely. James maintained his professional demeanor, though he could feel his heart rate increasing. This was highly irregular and potentially discriminatory. Mr. Keller, who exactly is this VIP passenger, and why would they request a specific captain they likely don't know? Richard hesitated, his explanation faltering. It's confidential, but I assure you this is authorized. Then you won't mind if I verify that, James replied, taking out his phone. I'm calling the chief pilot right now. As James dialed, Richard's confident facade cracked further. The supposed replacement pilot, Captain Dawson, leaned over and whispered something to Richard, then quickly excused himself and walked away down the jet bridge. The chief pilot answered on the third ring. Mark Stevens. Mark, it's James Wilson. I'm in Chicago about to operate the return leg to Atlanta, and I've just been told I'm being replaced due to a VIP passenger request. You know anything about this? There was a pause on the other end. James, no, there's no authorized crew change for your flight. Who told you this? A management trainee named Richard Keller. He's standing right here with a Captain Dawson who was supposedly taking my place. Another pause, longer this time. James, hold the departure. I'm calling Chicago operations right now. Don't leave the aircraft and don't let anyone else take command. I'll call you right back. James ended the call and turned to Richard, whose expression had shifted from authoritative to anxious. The chief pilot knows nothing about this change, Mr. Keller. He's contacting Chicago operations and has instructed me to maintain command of this aircraft. Tom, the gate agent, stepped away to make his own call, presumably to his supervisor. First Officer Chen stood nearby, watching the situation unfold with evident concern. Captain Wilson, she said quietly, the passengers are getting restless. Should I make an announcement? Not yet, James replied. Let's wait for clarification from the chief pilot. 5 tense minutes passed before James's phone rang again. James, it's Mark. There's no record of any authorized crew change, and there's no Captain Peter Dawson currently on duty in Chicago. Whatever this was, it wasn't legitimate. Continue as scheduled. I've contacted security, and they'll be there shortly to speak with Mr. Keller. Understood, James replied, ending the call. He turned to Richard, who now looked positively ill. Mr. Keller, security is on their way to discuss this situation with you. I suggest you wait for them at the gate. Without waiting for a response, James turned to Tom. We're cleared to continue boarding. I am the legitimate captain for this flight. As Richard was escorted away by airport security, James returned to the cockpit, his mind racing. In all his years of flying, he had faced discrimination in many forms, but never such a blatant attempt to remove him from command without cause. The implications were disturbing. First Officer Chen looked at him with concern. Captain, is everything all right? James took a deep breath, centering himself. It will be. Let's focus on our flight for now. We'll complete the pre-flight checklist and get these people to Atlanta safely. Yes, sir, she replied, clearly impressed by his composure. The remainder of the boarding process proceeded without incident, though James noticed the flight was running behind schedule due to the disruption. He made a brief announcement to the passengers explaining that they would be departing shortly and apologizing for the delay. As they were preparing for pushback, James's phone buzzed with a text from the chief pilot. Security reviewing gate cameras. Keller being questioned. Call me when you land in Atlanta. James acknowledged the message and then switched his full attention to the flight. Despite the unsettling confrontation, his professionalism never wavered. He conducted the pre-departure briefing with First Officer Chen, reviewed the weather updates, and ensured the aircraft was ready for the journey home. Once they were airborne, climbing steadily through 20,000 feet toward their cruising altitude, James finally had a moment to process what had happened. The apparent attempt to replace him mid-trip was troubling on multiple levels. Was it simple racism, or was something else at play? And who was this Captain Dawson, who had disappeared so quickly when questioned? First Officer Chen broke into his thoughts. Captain Wilson, if you don't mind me saying, the way you handled that situation on the ground was impressive. A lot of pilots would have lost their cool. James offered a small smile. When you've been flying as long as I have, you learn to save your reactions for things that affect flight safety. Getting angry wouldn't have helped the situation. Still, it was pretty outrageous, Chen persisted. Do you think it was because? She trailed off, uncomfortable with finishing the thought. Because I'm black. James completed her question matter-of-factly. Possibly, but in my experience, discrimination is rarely that simple. There's usually something else going on too. The flight continued smoothly, with James and Chen working together efficiently despite having just met. She was competent and quick to learn his preferences in the cockpit, a promising sign for a relatively new first officer. As they began their descent into Atlanta, James received a call from the lead flight attendant. Captain, we have a passenger in first class who's asking to speak with you after we land. says he's from the FAA. This was unusual but not unprecedented. FAA officials sometimes traveled on commercial flights and occasionally introduced themselves to the flight crew. "Thank you, Gloria. I'll meet with him at the gate after the passengers disembark." When they landed in Atlanta and completed their shutdown procedures, James expected to meet the FAA official, file his report about the Chicago incident, and head home for dinner with his wife and friends. Instead, what awaited him would escalate into the confrontation we witnessed at the beginning of this story. As James exited the cockpit and thanked the passengers who were filing off the aircraft, a security officer and a man in a suit were waiting in the jet bridge. "Captain Wilson." The suited man said, "I'm Richard Keller's supervisor, David Morgan. We need to speak with you about an incident involving unauthorized access to the flight deck in Chicago." James was momentarily confused. "Unauthorized access? I was the assigned captain for that flight. Mr. Keller tried to replace me with someone who apparently wasn't even on duty." The security officer stepped forward. "We have a report that you refused to comply with a crew change order and forced your way onto the aircraft." "That's completely false," James stated firmly. "Call the chief pilot, Mark Stevens. He confirmed I was the assigned captain and that no crew change was authorized." "We'll sort this out," Morgan said dismissively. "For now, we need you to come with us." "I have post-flight responsibilities to complete," James objected. "And there's an FAA official on the flight who asked to speak with me." "That can wait," the security officer insisted, reaching for James's arm. James stepped back. "I'm going to return to the flight deck to secure the aircraft properly. I suggest you contact the chief pilot immediately to clear this up." As James turned to re-enter the aircraft, he heard Morgan mutter something to the security officer. When he reached the cockpit door, the confrontation that opened our story began. "Sir, you need to step away from that cockpit. This aircraft is for authorized personnel only. I am Captain James Wilson, and according to federal aviation regulations, I am the pilot in command of this aircraft. Now I suggest you check my credentials before you make another mistake." The security officer's face flushed red as they stood in the narrow galley of the Boeing 737. Behind him, passengers who hadn't yet deplaned craned their necks to see what was happening. Some were already recording with their phones. Captain James Wilson, a 58-year-old veteran pilot with over 30 years of flying experience, stood calmly in his crisp uniform, gold stripes gleaming on his sleeves, his pilot's ID clearly visible on the lanyard around his neck. "I don't care who you claim to be," the security officer said, his voice rising. "We received a report of an unauthorized individual in the cockpit. You need to come with me now." James kept his composure, though his heart raced. In 3 decades of flying, he had faced this kind of treatment more times than he cared to remember. But not today. Not when his authority as captain was being so blatantly challenged without cause. "Officer," James said firmly, reaching into his pocket, "I'm going to take out my phone now. I'm calling the FAA's regional director, who happens to be a close friend. And then I'm calling your supervisor. This aircraft isn't going anywhere until this situation is properly resolved." The remaining passengers began to murmur. First Officer Chen approached from the cockpit, looking confused and concerned. "What's going on, Captain?" she asked. Before James could answer, the security officer grabbed his arm. "That's it, you're coming with me." "Take your hands off me, officer," James said, his voice steady but commanding. "You are interfering with a commercial airline captain in the performance of his duties, which is a federal offense." The officer hesitated, suddenly uncertain. At that moment, an older white man in a business suit stepped forward from the first-class cabin. "Perhaps I can help clarify the situation." He pulled out an identification badge. "Raymond Carlson, Federal Aviation Administration, Air Carrier Operations Inspector. I was a passenger on this flight, and I can confirm that this man is indeed Captain Wilson, the legitimate pilot in command of this aircraft." The security officer and Morgan both stared at the badge, their confidence visibly wavering. Inspector Carlson continued, "Furthermore, I witnessed the entire incident in Chicago and have already filed a preliminary report about the unauthorized attempt to remove Captain Wilson from his assigned flight. That, gentleman, is the actual security breach here, not Captain Wilson's presence on his own aircraft." James nodded gratefully to Carlson. "Thank you, Inspector." "Don't thank me yet, Captain," Carlson replied grimly. "This situation represents a serious breach of operational security and potentially discriminatory practices. As of this moment, I'm initiating an official FAA investigation." He turned to the security officer and Morgan. "Until we determine exactly what happened here and who authorized these actions, this aircraft is grounded." No further flights will be operated by this tail number until the FAA clears it. Morgan's face paled. You can't do that. We have a full schedule of flights. I absolutely can, Carlson interrupted. And I just did. Now I suggest you contact your legal department immediately because they're going to have a lot of explaining to do. The cabin fell completely silent as the gravity of the situation sank in. A grounded aircraft meant canceled flights, unhappy passengers, and significant financial impact for the airline. James felt a complex mixture of emotions: vindication that his authority was being upheld, concern about the disruption to operations, and a deep weariness at having to face such situations in 2025, decades into his career. Inspector Carlson turned to James. Captain Wilson, I'd like to take your official statement as part of this investigation, and I'll need to speak with your first officer and the chief pilot as well. Of course, James agreed. But first, I need to complete my post-flight responsibilities and secure this aircraft properly. Understood. I'll wait for you at the gate. As the security officer and Morgan retreated, looking defeated, James returned to the cockpit with First Officer Chen to complete their shutdown procedures. The remaining passengers disembarked, many of them shooting sympathetic glances or words of support to James as they passed. Captain, Chen said quietly as they worked, I've never seen anything like this. Is this really happening because? James sighed. Because I'm a black man in the captain's seat, partially. But I suspect there's more to this story than simple racism. Something doesn't add up about that supposed crew change in Chicago. Once the aircraft was properly secured, James and Chen left the cockpit and made their way to the gate, where Inspector Carlson was waiting along with a visibly agitated station manager and, to James's relief, Chief Pilot Mark Stevens. James, Mark greeted him with a firm handshake. I got here as fast as I could. This whole situation is unacceptable. I appreciate your support, Mark, James replied, noticing how the station manager seemed to deflate at the chief pilot's obvious allegiance. Let's take this somewhere private, Inspector Carlson suggested. I think the conference room in the operations center would be appropriate. As they walked through the terminal, James noticed Richard Keller standing nervously near the customer service desk, now accompanied by two airline executives in expensive suits who looked extremely concerned. One of them approached the group. Chief Pilot Stevens, I'm Vice President of Operations Robert Hamilton. I understand there's been some confusion today. I'd like to assure you that we're conducting an internal investigation. With all due respect, Mr. Hamilton, Carlson interjected, this is now an FAA matter. We'll need complete transparency about who authorized the attempt to remove Captain Wilson from his assigned flight and why. Of course, Hamilton nodded rapidly. Complete cooperation, but is it really necessary to ground the aircraft? We have hundreds of passengers. The grounding stands until I'm satisfied that proper procedures are being followed, Carlson stated firmly. This isn't just about today's incident. It's about ensuring the integrity of your operational systems and command structure. In the conference room, James provided a detailed account of the events in Chicago and Atlanta. First Officer Chen corroborated his story, as did the gate agent from Chicago, who joined by phone. Mark Stevens confirmed that no official crew change had been authorized and that James was the scheduled and legitimate captain for both legs of the trip. When it was Richard Keller's turn to explain himself, his story quickly fell apart. I was told by someone that Captain Wilson needed to be replaced for the return flight, he stammered. By whom exactly? Carlson pressed. I can't recall specifically. Mr. Keller, this is a federal investigation. Obstruction carries serious penalties. Keller's resolve crumbled. It was a passenger, a frequent flyer in our executive platinum program. He said he didn't feel comfortable with Captain Wilson as the pilot. James felt a familiar pain in his chest, the sting of prejudice he'd encountered throughout his career. But he maintained his professional demeanor, letting the investigation proceed. And you thought it appropriate to attempt to replace a senior captain based on a passenger's discriminatory preference? Carlson asked incredulously. The passenger has significant influence with our executive team, Keller admitted weakly. I thought I was protecting the company's interests. VP Hamilton looked mortified. That is absolutely not company policy or practice, Inspector Carlson. We would never condone such actions. Yet it happened, Carlson noted dryly. And who was this Captain Dawson who was supposed to replace Captain Wilson? He wasn't actually a captain, Keller admitted, staring at the floor. He's a simulator instructor who sometimes helps with pilot training. He has a commercial license but isn't qualified as a line pilot. The room fell silent as the full implications sank in. Not only had there been an attempt to remove James based on discriminatory grounds, but the airline had nearly allowed an unqualified pilot to take command of a commercial flight with passengers on board. "This is beyond unacceptable," Chief Pilot Stevens said, breaking the silence. "It's dangerous and potentially criminal." Inspector Carlson nodded grimly. "I agree. Captain Wilson, as the pilot in command who was subjected to this interference, you have the right to file formal charges if you wish." All eyes turned to James. Throughout his career, he had carefully chosen which battles to fight. He had encountered prejudice in many forms, from subtle microaggressions to outright discrimination, and had developed a seasoned judgment about when to push back and when to let things go. This moment, he knew, was larger than himself. It was about every pilot who looked like him and those who would come after. "I don't want to file criminal charges," James said finally. "What I want is structural change to ensure this never happens again, to me or to anyone else." He turned to VP Hamilton. "I want a full review of your procedures for crew assignments and changes. I want explicit protections against passenger discrimination affecting crew assignments. I want comprehensive training for all management personnel, especially new hires like Mr. Keller, on proper protocols and the legal authority of the pilot in command." "Of course, Captain Wilson," Hamilton agreed quickly. "We can implement all of that immediately. And I want a formal, public apology from the airline, not to me personally, but to all the pilots who have faced similar situations without the benefit of an FAA inspector witnessing it." Inspector Carlson smiled slightly. "I think those are reasonable requests, Mr. Hamilton, and they would go a long way toward mitigating the FAA's concerns about your operational practices." "Agreed," Hamilton said, looking relieved that criminal charges weren't being pursued. "We'll begin implementing these changes immediately, and the apology will be issued by our CEO tomorrow. One more thing," James added. "I want to be part of the team that develops the new training program. My experience could be valuable in helping others understand the real-world impact of these issues." "Absolutely," Hamilton confirmed. "Your input would be invaluable." As the meeting concluded, Inspector Carlson informed them that the aircraft would remain grounded until the airline provided detailed documentation of their new procedures and training protocols. The financial impact would be significant, but it would ensure the seriousness of the situation was understood at all levels of management. Outside the conference room, James checked his phone and found several missed calls from his wife Lisa. He quickly called her back. "James, are you all right?" Lisa asked immediately. "It's all over social media, videos of you being confronted by security, the FAA grounding the plane. What happened?" "I'm fine," he assured her. "It's been a challenging day, but I think some good might come of it. I'll tell you everything over dinner." "The Williamsons called. They saw the videos too and insisted on postponing dinner. They thought you might need a quiet evening at home instead." James smiled at his wife's thoughtfulness. "That's probably for the best. It's been quite a day." "I'm proud of you," Lisa said softly. "Whatever happened, I know you handled it with dignity." "I'll be home soon," James promised. "I love you." As he ended the call, James saw First Officer Chen waiting nearby. "Captain Wilson, I just wanted to say, what I saw today will stay with me throughout my career. The way you stood your ground while remaining professional, it was a master class in leadership." James smiled. "Thank you, Sarah. Just remember, the stripes on our shoulders come with responsibilities beyond just flying the aircraft. Sometimes we have to stand up for the integrity of the profession itself." As James left the operations center, he noticed a small crowd of pilots and flight attendants in the hallway. As he approached, they parted to make way for him, many offering words of support or respectful nods. Among them was young Darnell Jackson, the regional airline first officer he'd met in Chicago. "Captain Wilson," Darnell said, stepping forward. "Word travels fast in this industry. What you did today, standing up to discrimination while upholding the highest professional standards, it's exactly why you've been a role model for so many of us." James was moved by the young pilot's words and the evident respect from his colleagues. Throughout his career, he had often felt the weight of being the first, or one of the few. Today, looking at the diverse faces around him, including young pilots like Darnell and Sarah Chen, he could see the fruits of decades of persistence and professionalism. "Thank you all," he said sincerely. "But this isn't just my victory. It's a step forward for all of us for the integrity of our profession and the principle that the only thing that matters in the cockpit is competence, not color." As James headed home to his wife, he felt a sense of cautious optimism. The incident had been painful, but the response from the FAA, from his chief pilot, from his colleagues, suggested that times were indeed changing, however slowly. He had stood his ground, maintained his dignity, and upheld the authority and responsibility vested in him as captain. In the days that followed, the airline made good on its promises. A public apology was issued, new training programs were developed with James's input, and explicit policies were implemented to prevent passenger preferences from affecting crew assignments. Richard Keller was reassigned to a position with no operational authority, and the simulator instructor who had posed as Captain Dawson was terminated. More significantly, the incident sparked a broader industry conversation about discrimination in aviation and the challenges still faced by minority pilots. Professional pilot organizations issued statements of support, and several major airlines took the opportunity to review their own procedures and training. For James, personally, the incident reinforced his commitment to mentoring the next generation of pilots. He became more involved with programs that encouraged young people from underrepresented groups to consider careers in aviation, sharing his experiences and offering guidance on navigating the challenges they might face. A month after the incident, James was invited to speak at a national aviation conference about the importance of maintaining the authority of the pilot in command and combating discrimination in the cockpit. His speech, delivered with the same calm authority he had displayed throughout the confrontation, received a standing ovation from industry leaders and regulators alike. In the end, he concluded, aviation safety depends on respect for established protocols and procedures. When we allow bias, whether conscious or unconscious, to interfere with those protocols, we compromise the foundation of everything we've built. The pilot in command must be chosen for competence, not appearance. The flight deck is no place for prejudice. As James returned to his regular flight schedule, he noticed subtle but significant changes. There was a new awareness among ground staff and management about appropriate interactions with flight crews. His authority as captain seemed to be questioned less frequently, and he received reports from other minority pilots that they too were experiencing fewer instances of having their credentials challenged. The passenger who had originally requested James's removal never flew with the airline again, having been quietly informed that discriminatory requests regarding crew assignments would not be honored. 6 months later, James received a letter from the FAA informing him that his actions had contributed to an important safety bulletin being issued to all commercial airlines regarding the protection of pilot-in-command authority and the prevention of discriminatory interference in crew assignments. On the 1-year anniversary of the incident, James was flying the same route, Atlanta to Chicago and back. As he completed his pre-flight checks, he noticed a familiar face boarding the aircraft, Inspector Raymond Carlson from the FAA, this time in casual clothes. "Captain Wilson," Carlson greeted him warmly. "Good to see you again. Just a passenger today, heading to Chicago for my granddaughter's graduation." "Good to see you too, Inspector, and thank you again for your intervention last year." "It made a real difference, not just for me, but for the industry." "I was just doing my job," Carlson replied modestly, "but I've been following the changes implemented since then. Your advocacy has had a significant impact." As they prepared for departure, James made his standard welcome announcement to the passengers. Looking out at the diverse faces of his crew, First Officer Darnell Jackson, now upgraded from regional jets, and a cabin crew that reflected the changing demographics of the industry, James felt a deep sense of satisfaction. Aviation, like America itself, was a work in progress, constantly evolving, sometimes stumbling, but ultimately moving toward a future where competence and character mattered more than color. He had played his part in that progress, standing firm when it mattered most, choosing wisdom over anger, and using his position to create change rather than merely complain about injustice. As the powerful engines spooled up and the aircraft began its roll down the runway, James felt the familiar thrill of flight, that moment when human ingenuity overcomes the bounds of Earth. In that moment, as in every takeoff of his long career, nothing mattered but his skill, his judgment, and his responsibility to the people who had placed their trust in him. And that, he knew, was exactly as it should be. If you're enjoying this story, please consider subscribing to hear more stories like this. The Boeing 737 lifted smoothly into the Georgia sky, carrying Captain James Wilson and his passengers toward Chicago, just as it had a year before. But this time, there would be no confrontation, no challenge to his authority, only the profound respect he had earned through decades of excellence, and the courage to stand for what was right, even when it would have been easier to step aside. In the end, that courage had not only preserved his own dignity, but had helped create a slightly better world for all the pilots who would follow in his path. And for James Wilson, that legacy of positive change was worth far more than any stripes on his shoulders or any title before his name. Thank you for listening. If this story touched you, please subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments.